Hello, my name is Michi and I will be talking about motor learning and attention. The title of the research is Attention During Skill Acquisition of a Dart Throwing Task among the Alexander Technique Experts. And Alexander Technique is something that I have always been fascinated and I'm going to briefly introduce about it today. So here's an overview of the presentation. There will be some overlaps between introduction and literature review. I will be especially focusing on attention and motor learning because motor learning is a rather big topic. So how you use attention when you learn a motor task is the key in my research. Okay, so let's dive into the introduction. In this slide, I will give you the background of two important concepts in my research. The first one is about past studies that investigated attention and motor learning, and the second one is about a motor learning strategy that uses a particular type of attention. Okay, so the first concept is the focus of attention. Past studies mainly focus on two types of attention. The first one is called the external focus of attention, and this is the type of attention directed towards the movement effect. In other words, you are attending to the goal of the movement. For example, when you throw a dart, and if you attend to the dartboard, you are using the external focus of attention. The second one is called the internal focus of attention, and this is another type of attention directed towards the movement kinematics, your body basically. For example, again, when you throw the dart and if you attend to your arm movement, which is directly relevant to the throwing task, you are using the internal focus of attention. So past studies investigated these two types of attention and always found the external focus of attention produces the better motor performance. And I will explain this more later. So the second concept is the Alexander technique. I can talk about this technique for hours since I have been interested in this since high school, but essentially, it is a body-mind technique that you can use to learn any motor skill. So it is a learning technique, but right now it is often considered as a type of alternative medicine by academia. And in my research, I will be focusing on the attentional aspect of the technique, and I will explain more in literature review, but it uses a special type of attention that is similar to the internal focus of attention, but the emphasis is a little bit different. So this slide is about some issues with past studies. Now I will explain this in my literature review in a bit more detail, but essentially there are three problems. Firstly, I just said in the last slide that the external focus of attention produces a better result, but the reasoning behind is problematic. It is almost always based on the constrained action hypothesis, which is first introduced in 1998, I believe. It basically says that the external focus of attention is better precisely because it does not interfere with the automatic skill execution. Automatic meaning you don't have to think about what your body is doing when you perform a certain skill. The internal focus of attention disrupts the automatic skill execution because it attends to the body movement. It might make sense, of course, but I think there's room for more exploration. The second problem is about how attentional strategies were evaluated. I will talk about this later, but basically, past studies did not control attention when evaluating the performance, which I think is a big issue. Finally, the Alexander technique is not being considered as a motor learning tool. As I said, it is considered as the alternative medicine like massage and yoga. It may look similar on the outside, but the Alexander technique is fundamentally different from them because it is a learning technique that you actively applies to a certain motor skill. So the research question is, as written in the slide, Is the Alexander technique an effective learning tool to improve the performance of a novel motor task among the Alexander technique experts? And in my research, I will be using a dart throwing task as the novel task. And the purpose of this study is to investigate the Alexander technique as a learning strategy and how experts in the Alexander technique utilize attention when learning the novel motor task. Significance of study. I think it is threefold. First, it will be the first study that aims to take an empirical approach to investigate the efficacy of the Alexander technique, focusing on attention during motor learning. Second, it may or may not challenge the constrained action hypothesis. Third, the investigation of the technique may transform its academic presence as a physical treatment, being considered on the same plane as yoga and meditation. I think it can actually be considered as a learning tool as it was originally intended. Okay, so the limitations. All participants are unfamiliar with dart throwing task used in the present study, and the Alexander teacher needs to be officially certified. Limitations. Participants are sufficiently able to articulate about the nature of the technique, and I will talk about this in the method section. And researchers rely on participants employing a certain attention strategy. Okay, and assumptions. All participants have the equal ability to learn or acquire a novel motor task, and all participants have the equal attentional resources to practice a motor task. Okay, hypothesis. Null hypothesis is there is no difference in the learning outcomes between control, the external focus of attention, the internal focus of attention, and the Alexander technique groups. The research hypothesis is the type of attention used by the Alexander technique improves the performance based on the constrained action hypothesis because the Alexander technique directs attention away from the task-relevant kinematics. So, operational definitions. The Alexander technique. It's a body-mind technique to improve bodily movements. And motor learning. Uh, it is learning a skill of simple or complex motor tasks. The emphasis on the process of learning and the acquisition of the skill is not necessarily required. A motor performance. It is performing a certain skill where the performer is aware of being evaluated. So, in literature review, I will first talk about the focus of attention and then the Alexander technique. As I said in the introduction, the external focus of attention, which is to focus on the goal of the movement, like attending to dartboard, is advantageous in motor learning. But the interpretation for the constrained action hypothesis might be problematic. It specifically says that the internal focus of attention interferes with the automatic skill execution because you are attending to your body. In other words, it is like when you do something and start thinking about doing the thing, your performance is not as good. But does this mean that the external focus of attention is good, or the fact that you are not using the internal focus of attention is good? We are not too certain. The second problem is how the performance is evaluated. I believe the study conducted by Monell and Wolf 2018 would underscore the problem. Basically, they compared the internal focus of attention and the external focus of attention when playing musical instruments, piano, trumpets, and so on. And people in the internal focus of attention group practiced by focusing on finger movements. And people in the external focus of attention practiced by focusing on the expression of musical piece. And the performance was evaluated by musical experts, and the results showed that musicians in the external focus of attention group performed more expressively, and the technical precision, which is to play right notes, were the same for these two groups. It sounds all standard, but what the study was missing is to control attention when the evaluation took place. Participants were not instructed to use a particular type of attention during the evaluation, and I think this could influence the result and cannot evaluate the learning effect appropriately because motor learning and motor performance are different subjects. Now, the Alexander technique. As I said, the Alexander technique is often considered as a curative treatment rather than the motor learning strategy. And this is a huge problem because it was originally intended as a learning strategy. So the Alexander technique in terms of attention has three important components: inhibition, primary control, and direction. And inhibition is when you inhibit your initial urge to perform the action. So when you throw a dart, you do not throw the dart. The primary control is the relationship between the head, the neck, and the back. It is a tensional relationship that is not too slack or too tense. Then direction, which is a mental direction to maintain the primary control during the skill execution. So basically, when the primary control is disrupted during the skill execution, you stop the skill execution and start everything all over. Um, it is very hard to describe the entire process in action, so I'm going to only focus on the attention aspect in this slide. So, when you use the Alexander technique in dart throwing, you are not thinking about the dartboard or your arm movement. You're thinking about the primary control not being disrupted. So the attention is neither directly relevant to movement kinematics nor the movement effect. This means that if the constrained action hypothesis is applied to the Alexander technique, it may not interfere with the automatic skill execution because you are tending to your body, but not directly relevant components of the movement, like the internal focus of attention. Okay, so here's a summary of literature review. First, it is not certain whether the external focus of attention is beneficial or the fact that the attention is away from the movement kinematics results in better performance. Second, past studies did not control attention during motor performance. Third, the Alexander technique utilizes attention that is considered as neither the external nor the internal focus of attention, because attention is directed towards the inhibition of habitual response or the primary control being interrupted. Okay, so here's the hypothesis again, and this time I'm going to only read about research hypothesis. So research hypothesis is the type of attention used by the Alexander technique improves the performance based on the constrained action hypothesis because the Alexander technique directs attention away from the task-relevant kinematics. So the study design, I will be using quasi-experimental designs, and this is mainly because I cannot use random sampling. Instead, I'm using the cluster sampling. There are two reasons to this. First, the Alexander technique population is scattered all over the world, and I can only select population in a very specific region, most likely Tokyo, Japan. And second, teaching style of the Alexander teacher may vary. I'm using Alexander technique students as participants so that I need to control the teaching style of the Alexander technique teacher. So overall, I think quasi-experimental design is appropriate. So participants, experienced AT practitioners who have undergone at least 20 AT lessons may participate in the study. Gender, age, and nationalities of participants are not considered, but they are probably people who live in Tokyo. And participants must demonstrate the understanding of the AT by taking a short quiz, which I will talk about it later. And participants who have experience in dart throwing will be excluded from the data analysis. And as for the recruitment, the AT students of one AT teacher will be asked to participate in the study because different AT teachers may teach the technique in a slightly different manner, which may increase the sampling error. It is appropriate because it will strengthen the internal validity of the study by reducing the extraneous variable. On this slide, I'm going to talk about the instruments that will be used in the experiment. Darts and dartboard. A standard board with 10 concentric circles of various diameters will be used. It will be placed on the wall, 1.72 meters from the floor, which is a standard practice of darts. Short quiz. Short quiz consists of a series of open-ended questions about the Alexander technique, such as the short description and practical applications of the technique. Example questions would be like, identify important components of the AT, and how would you utilize the AT for walking? Likert scale, and this is used to make sure that participants are employing the attention strategy that are intended for each condition. It'll be clear, I think, when I explain the procedure of the experiment. A Likert scale will be provided to participants during practice of the motor task. Example questions would be, how much were you able to use the attention strategy? Okay, now procedures. Firstly, IRB. I believe a full review will be required. Now, the experiment may not meet the criteria of the full review in terms of the population characteristics and sensitive topics, but it failed the criteria in the expedited review that states data collected is not non-invasive procedures routinely employed in clinical practice. The Alexander technique is not routinely employed and the risk factor is unknown. Of course, I do not think there's any risk, but that decision should be properly reviewed. And power analysis. Power analysis will be conducted to determine the minimal sample size. Okay, so on this slide, I'm going to talk about the actual procedure. The experiment has three phases: the pretest, the skill acquisition, and the retention. The purpose of the pretest is to determine whether to include participants in the experiment and to assess the initial skill of dart throwing. Informed consent will be given to participants and they take short quiz to demonstrate their knowledge about the Alexander technique. Then they complete 6 throws, standing 2 meters away from the wall, throwing as quickly as possible. Throwing as quickly as possible is actually important because this will prevent them from using any attention strategy. Now, the skill acquisition phase. Participants will throw 60 times in total. They are also asked to answer a question in the Likert scale every 30 throws. The question is, how well were you able to use the strategy? This will make sure that they are actually using a certain attention strategy when practicing. In the actual practice, participants will be assigned to either the internal, the external, the Alexander technique, or control group. The control group will be asked to come backwards from 1000 while throwing darts to prevent them to use any attention strategy. And finally, the retention phase. Participants are again asked to complete 6 throws, standing 2 meters away from the wall, throwing as quickly as possible. And the whole experiment can be done in one setting. So data entry. and data collected will be manually input into Microsoft Excel. And for statistical analysis, I believe between subjects one way or another will be used because there's one independent variable, which is attention, and each participant receives only one treatment. Okay, so this is it. Thank you for listening and God bless you.